Starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is our first weekend edition of the new year, 2018. Of course, we've already looked back a little bit over 2017. We'll do that again and look ahead to 2018. As we always do on this program, we have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. We'll spend some time looking at religious liberties. Matter of fact, the first two articles here, one by Kelly Shackelford's First Liberty and one by Rebecca Hagelin, deal with that. Then we're going to get into some of the other conversations about some of the accomplishments of the Trump administration, where it goes in the future, what that might mean for elections. And, of course, a book out that has quotes from Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and how we're even going to cover all that, I have no idea. But Penna Dexter, we, as always, have a lot to cover. And, by the way, we have all sorts of tumult right now in Iran. We have a question about whose button is bigger with North Korea. So we just have a lot to talk about today.
Well, there is. And, you know, in the area of foreign policy, Trump has gotten probably more compliments and had better accomplishments in his first year than maybe in some of the other areas. But, of course, they're really after him now for his comments about the nuclear button. I liked it. I thought it's kind of a backdrop for any talks that are going to take place between South Korea and North Korea, just to kind of, in Trump's own way, let the world know that, you know, we're strong on this and we are ready. And you know, we are the nuclear power of the world, so why not say so?
My button's bigger than yours. I don't know. I've heard that on the streets sometimes, into playgrounds. But nevertheless, we'll get into that in just a minute. But Kelly Shackelford, one of the things we always love to do when you're here, and some days you're here and some days you're not because you are a very busy individual, is to talk about religious liberty. The first article, some of the four, really, if you will, top threats to your religious liberty. And then in just a few minutes, I want to get to Rebecca Hagelin, who's been a good friend of this ministry over the years, making 2018 the year of religious freedom. But let's talk about some of the various issues in religious liberty. And one that we mentioned earlier in the week was FEMA, because FEMA up until recently has said, well, if you are engaged in religious activity, at least 50% of the time, then separation of church and state, you don't qualify for all the other kinds of loans we provide for everybody else, even though your church might have been the ones that were the first to the scene, providing relief for disaster care, and actually may be doing more good than even FEMA. Nevertheless, FEMA says, no, we can't let the churches get any kind of federal funding. What about this?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I think most Americans thought it was ridiculous. This is really unique because what you had here is really the law says you're not supposed to discriminate against religious groups. And then what was happening was, and this started from, I think, under the Clinton administration, they passed a policy, not law, on how FEMA was going to implement these things, and they put in, again, remember, the law says you're not allowed to discriminate against religious groups. They said, well, on this giving of funding or aid for buildings whose structure was damaged, that includes nonprofits. However, if you are 50% or more religious, you don't qualify. Again, that violates the law. But that's what had been done since Clinton administration. Well, President Trump said that he thought that religious groups should get this. So when this happened, we represented a number of churches who were obviously the main people providing the help. And we said, this is, our friends at the Beckett Fund just filed a lawsuit on behalf of churches. Mm-hmm. We thought, well, that doesn't make sense because the president has already said he doesn't agree with this. So this is something they can change because this isn't the law.
Right.
And so we sent a letter, and following our letter, the Attorney General for the state of Texas and the governor sent a letter as well, sort of, parroting what we said and said, you need to change this. And now it's been changed. And so, what was fun is seeing the comments from the pastors. They're just thrilled that the discrimination is going to stop, because I mean what they went through was unbelievable, and they were the ones not only suffering from the harm, the very harm that was supposed to be, aid was supposed to be given to, but they were the ones helping the people at the same time. So if anybody deserves to have their structures, have some help on their structures that are damaged, it's not only people who are damaged, but people who are helping other people in the whole process.
It's really an old principle, I think, of poverty relief or, social justice, that the churches, because they're closest to the situation, because they have the mind of God and of Christ, they'll be the ones helping. And so in this particular situation, they're suffering too. And it just only makes common sense. I'm so glad that this whole situation, these hurricanes, actually brought about the righting of a wrong policy. So, in that sense, there's a real silver lining.
When I did the commentary back in September, I used a line that one of the pastors said, and that is, Hurricane Harvey did not pick and choose which structures it was going to destroy. So why is FEMA going to pick and choose which structures it's going to help rebuild?
Absolutely. And if people don't, they wonder where they can get info on this. We have, I think, our weekly alert about to go out. If people don't get that, they can go to firstliberty.org, and at the top it says Get Updates, and every week you'll get an update. But we're about to send one out, I think today. It's going to include not only FEMA, but some other updates on religious freedom that have happened this week. So it's good news. I mean, you might be listening to this thinking, hey, I know a church that was impacted. I wonder if they know that they can participate, because
Some
they probably don't.
Yeah, it hasn't been well covered.
And this is something that hasn't been allowed for, decades now, and now it is allowed. And again, people, we're going to talk about this later, obviously, with the book. People say things about President Trump, but realize what he just did, okay? He just stopped a massive religious discrimination that was happening against churches, and not only churches, but the churches who were the backbone of the relief effort. And so, you got to balance these things out. People so want to get into the personality part, but let's make sure we look at actions too that touch upon religious freedom in our churches and the good that they're doing. This is going to do a lot of good, not just with the hurricanes that just occurred, but all the disasters that occur in the future, where the church is ground zero of the one that reaches out to people. They're now not going to be discriminated against. They're now going to be treated the same as everybody else, which is going to allow them to help more people and have more impact in all of these situations.
Again, we have a number of successes. Of course, the 7-2 decision in the Trinity Lutheran case, which again said that churches should not be denied opportunities to get some of those benefits. And now this case with FEMA. Let me just mention that one of the articles we're going to come back and talk about are those 4 top threats to your religious liberty. Prayer is on trial, military religious rights are on trial, freedom for religion at work is on trial, and houses of worship are on trial. So we have a lot more to talk about. They're going to move on to all sorts of other topics. It's a busy day. We'll do our best. Be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Someone who tuned into Point of View for the first time left a comment on the Facebook page criticizing what one of my guests said and concluded by instructing us that Christians should embrace socialism. It's the type of comment I usually ignore, but I thought it might deserve a response since I've heard it so often. Over the last few months, I've been teaching through the book of Acts. When you get to Acts 4, you find a statement that the believers had all things in common. It also says those who possessed land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds to the apostles' feet. They distributed these gifts to anyone in need. It is worth noting that, number one, this practice was apparently only done in Jerusalem, and number two, the practice was a voluntary act. This is hardly a mandate for socialism. Many Christian writers have devoted whole chapters in their books on this subject, so there is more than I can possibly say here. The believers in Jerusalem owned the property before they voluntarily gave the proceeds to the apostles. The next chapter clearly teaches that. When Peter confronted Ananias, he clearly stated, "While it remained, was it not your own? After it was sold, was it not in your own control?" Owning property contradicts one of the fundamental principles of socialism. In the Communist Manifesto, the abolition of property is a major item in the plan for moving from capitalism to socialism and eventually to communism. The 10 Commandments assume private property. The 8th commandment forbidding stealing and the 10th commandment about coveting both assume that people have private property rights. In the New Testament, Paul writes, "Let him who stole steal no more." Socialism is incompatible with Christianity. That's why Christians should not embrace socialism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I know when we have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford here, we don't have a lot of phone calls because you just want to sit back and listen. A lot of that happened yesterday when we had with Gary Bauer. I think we got a call or two, but everybody says, no, I just want to hear what he has to say. I don't want to interrupt it all. So feel free if you'd like to, but if not, sit back and take some notes. Kelly Shackelford, top threats to your religious liberty. First of all, that's a link immediately to First Liberty. I would encourage people to support you. I do. Matter of fact, I just got your latest appeal letter. I'm going to write a check as soon as I get home today to support you because I think so highly of what you do. But these threats are reminding us that even though we've had some real successes, for example, I mentioned Trinity Lutheran. We just mentioned the FEMA case. When you go to Oregon, we didn't have as much of a success there, and so there's still a lot of battles to fight, aren't there?
Absolutely. I think we cataloged a number. It's very unusual for us. I think this time last year at First Liberty, we had one case on the way to the Supreme Court for them to take. This year, right now, we have 6.
6.
So
wow.
It's
I've not heard that.
Yeah, what's about to happen this year, I think, is going to be and this is in addition to what's already there, right? I mean, they just had the Masterpiece case, which is the Jack Phillips, the gay wedding cake case that most people have heard about. There's another case coming up. It's already there. And this is in addition to all those. And I think we sort of took a number of the cases and put them in some things to be looking for. But one of them is the issue of prayer. Mm-hmm. We have 2 cases on their way to the Supreme Court that experts say are highly likely to be taken, which normally you don't say about a Supreme Court case. And they take about
70, 80.
Yeah, out of 8,000.
8,000.
So about 1%. Mm-hmm. But in this case, we have 2 en banc decisions. En banc means it's very unusual. Usually at the Federal Court of Appeals, you get 3 judges. En banc means they've decided all 15 of them are going to sit and hear it, which happens like almost never. Mm-hmm. We had 2 en bancs from different Federal Court of Appeals, each covering 4 to 5 states, and they were exact same fact pattern, and they went the opposite way in their decision.
Right.
And this is about whether, that we've got this Supreme Court case a few years ago that said, can you have prayer before government meetings? Well, of course you can, because it goes all the way back to the founding. So now the ACLU is arguing, yeah, but in this case, these county commissioners, they didn't invite somebody in to pray. They prayed. We can't have county commissioners themselves praying. And I'm like, why not? You know, I mean, the founders prayed. They didn't think it was some, I don't know, something that you need that you have to hire out for in order to have a prayer. But, the Fourth Circuit said it's unconstitutional. The Sixth Circuit said it is constitutional. I think that'll go. In addition to that, we have the case in the 11th Circuit where 2 Christian schools were denied the right to have a prayer before the state championship football game by the Florida High School Athletic Association. So there's a prayer kind of thing. We've also got the Veterans Memorials, the Bladensburg Memorial, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. It's been there for over 90 years. It's a cross that was put up in part by money from mothers who lost their sons in World War I. Had a 3-judge panel, 2 Obama appointees and 1 Clinton appointee. The 2 Obama appointees said this is unconstitutional. You can't have this memorial. The Clinton appointee said that's outrageous. Of course, there's nothing unconstitutional about this. That's got to go to the Supreme Court because, this would set a precedent for memorials all over the country. Plus, the Fourth Circuit, where this decision was made, within that circuit is Arlington National Cemetery. So if this were to stand and be precedent, they would have to go into Arlington National Cemetery and tear the crosses down. Mm-hmm. Now, some people think, because they realized this was a danger, so in the opinion they said, this wouldn't affect Arlington because, the people made their own choice for what they put on their own tombstone. Yeah, but they ignored completely on purpose. There are a number of crosses there that are not people's tombstone. There's the cross of sacrifice, which is given to us by Canada. It's 24 feet tall. The Argonne Cross, which is 40. You're going to have to tear all those down. Yeah. And so I think that case is one that's definitely, got to be looked at seriously by the Supreme Court. And there are so many others. I don't want to take all of our time. But there are a lot of these battles coming, and we just sort of laid out the 4 things to really look for because there's a number of cases, and all of those are on their way to the Supreme Court.
On prayer, back to the prayer category, what about Coach Joe Kennedy?
That's exactly right. That's one of the next ones as well. That's about to be on its way to the Supreme Court. I think everybody knows, but Coach Kennedy, who went to a knee after the football game for 15 to 20 seconds all by himself to say a silent prayer and was fired. And the Ninth Circuit ruled in that case that, and you'd think, well, maybe say that he's trying to coerce the kids or something. No. That's not that. There were no facts on that. In fact, they admitted that wasn't true. So what did the Ninth Circuit say? The Ninth Circuit said no coach can pray in public if anyone can see them, even a spectator. If somebody sees you, so prayer is the new pornography in the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit is the most overturned circuit in the country, but the court has to take a case before it can overturn it. So that's one that there's going to be a lot of. That's the only case I know of that Donald Trump has tweeted about twice. And so we'll see when this thing goes to the Supreme Court if now President Donald Trump will still do something about that. Whether he'll tweet about it, whether the Justice Department will weigh in, I don't know. But that one's definitely one coming down the line.
Very good.
We also posted Rebecca Hagelin's town hall article, and I love that she highlighted the Klein Oregon Baker case because, as we mentioned, the Masterpiece Bakery case has already been heard at the Supreme Court. The decision will come down in June, and that could be decided very narrowly, or it could go the wrong way. So this case is very important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's very possible after watching the oral argument, listening to the oral argument, that this could be a narrow decision. That doesn't mean it will, but Justice Kennedy, who is the swing vote, was very upset by the bias and the prejudice that was expressed by the State of Colorado Commission that did this to the baker. And if that's the case, you can strike down, and rule for the baker in that case by saying this was religious bias, it was religious prejudice. We've got these public statements of them saying they don't like religious people, essentially. That's enough alone to rule for the baker. Well, that doesn't really decide the issue.
That's right.
And if that's the case, then what is one of the next cases coming? And it's the Oregon, it's the Kleins.
Yeah.
So that very well could be that Supreme Court case will obviously have a great impact if it goes beyond a narrow ruling and rules on the issues that are going to come in play there.
Talk about if it was a broad ruling. It probably will not be, so let's not spend too much time on it. But we've said before that a ruling that is really broad could affect not just bakers, but florists and innkeepers and photographers. We've talked about this with Wesley J. Smith, that indeed it could affect bioethics in terms of whether doctors and nurses could have freedom of conscience. So we really hope it's a narrow ruling. Unless it's a good ruling, then a broad ruling would be very helpful for religious liberty, right?
It's a very dangerous if it's a broad ruling in the wrong way, because it essentially means you don't have a religious conscience. And in fact, it goes even further. It would mean that the government can now tell citizens of the United States that they have to express things not only that they disagree with, but that violate their beliefs and their conscience.
Compelled speech.
That's a really extreme power for the government to ever have. It never should have in this country, but that's what it would mean. It would mean that the government can say, you know what, we've decided that it's important that you not take this opposite position, and therefore we're going to force you to speak the government's message. And, you know, it's one thing for the government to say this is the right way to do this, and you're not allowed to get in the way. It's another thing to say for the government to say, we are going to force you to participate in something that you consider sin. That's a very dangerous road to ever go by. So hopefully we don't get there, but that's part of what the danger of the Masterpiece case case is, and we're going to have to wait and see. And people need to be in prayer, because that decision could come down any day. It could come down as late as, you know, June 27th, I think is the last day of the term, maybe. So between now and then, there's a lot of things going on behind the court, and Justice Kennedy is a swing vote, and so really focus your prayer in that direction.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we will move into some other topics. One has to do with the fact that Brett Stevens, who, by the way, has been on the program with us before, it's been a while, who is kind of the conservative at the New York Times, lists all these things that Donald Trump did and still says he would prefer Hillary Clinton. And so that caused another individual who's been on the program with us quite frequently, as a matter of fact, just recently, Cal Thomas, who said, wait a minute, let's talk about that. And that, of course, gets us into the back and forth between Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and a couple of other issues. Of course, we'll also get into a little bit later some of the foreign policy topics, so we have a lot to cover. And if you'd like to know more about Kelly Shackelford, certainly you can go to the website, pointofview.net. Those of you that are donors, I might just mention the next Outlook issues on religious liberty and what your rights are for your kids in school. We'll be back with more right after this.
What difference does it make when you support Point of View? For Lee Weaver and his family, it meant doing something to reach out to women in need, and so far, to help bring nearly 5,000 babies into the world.
As a family, we were sitting around the dinner table. Our older daughter said, Dad, we need to do something about it. And that kind of struck a chord in our family. All of that started out of Point of View and the effect it had on our conversations and our heart, leading us into don't be hearers only, but doers of the word. Point of View has always been real supporters of the concept that we're a small part of.
Your support of Point of View inspires people to do great things. You partner in spreading truth around the world. But the only way to make that happen is for you to make the call or visit us online and join the Truth Team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Do it now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford in studio with us today. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We don't spend a lot of time on this program talking about who's up and who's down and who's in favor and who's in disfavor in the White House. But, you know, when a book comes out or is coming out about Steve Bannon, we'll get into that in just a minute. But before we do, maybe to set the scene, the third article we've posted here is by Cal Thomas. And Cal Thomas is a good friend, and we've interacted over the years. Matter of fact, last time we had him on the program, we talked about how he got his a newspaper column started, and I even reminded him that I had actually met the person that actually helped him get it started before that, when he worked at the Dallas Times-Herald, before he worked at the Los Angeles Times and all the rest. And so we've had a great relationship. And he also is not the kind of person to spend a lot of time talking about other columnists, other commentators, but he sort of broke his rule too, because Bret Stephens, who used to be with the Wall Street Journal, now is kind of the conservative at the New York Times, and I did put air quotes up for those, went through this long list, which we've talked about before, Penna and Kelly, about what has been accomplished under the Trump administration. It's a pretty significant list. And then at the end, with a surprise, says, but I still would have preferred Hillary Clinton. And I had trouble following that when I first saw it, and I was glad that Cal Thomas wrote about it, so we've posted it on our website.
Well, it doesn't make sense, because if you're just going on character, you can't hold Hillary Clinton up as a stellar character to contrast with Donald Trump. I mean, if you had someone, you know, maybe I could see it if you had someone that had a demonstrably good character. But in this case, I mean, we're electing the president. We're electing him to lead the country in positive ways, to improve the economy, to improve the country, to perhaps do something about immigration. All the reasons that Donald Trump was elected, he's meeting and filling campaign promises like crazy. And so, you know, I mean, I think a lot of us who weren't for Trump at the beginning or during the campaign till he was finally nominated, we had to decide, okay, are we going to be a never Trumper, or are we going to get on board? And you make the calculation, well, what's good for the country? No, I can't have an angel in the White House. There was no angel to choose from. And so this to me is disingenuous. And I see this in others. I read the Washington Post, and Michael Gerson, who was a speechwriter for Bush and pro-life and all of that, and really tough on national security and spreading freedom. And every day, every column is a screed against Donald Trump. Same thing, though. He agrees with most of the policies. And then you even see people that are in more of the Christian world, like the Eric Ericksons of the world, the David French. Well, they'll give Trump some kudos for things, but still there's this underlying critique of the character always present. And I think it's enough already after the year is over. First of all, a lot of the things that people criticize are going away. The chaos in the White House that was described in the book that we will talk about later, it was a little bit to be expected, because this was a person who'd never held office before. There was a learning curve, a big learning curve. There was a lot of chaos. There were a lot of mistakes made in appointments and how they were handled. But a lot of it's calming down now. So let's let this president get on with it. That's just my point.
Juncture. One of the many examples that comes to my mind when you say that, Penna, is think of the press secretary. Okay, Sean Spicer had a rough go of it. Okay,
you think
he had a rough go of it?
Yes.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders is, I think, the best press secretary I've ever seen.
She is amazing.
I mean, she is just. I mean, I know her personally, but I've just been sitting here, you know, a gaff, you know, just with my mouth open, going, "Wow, is she great?"
Yeah.
You know, she's doing an excellent job, and I think that's happening in a number of different areas. And this article, you know, there's no explanation, because this article is incredibly illogical. I mean, what's the word? Foolish. There's no words for it, because
there's a big disconnect.
Yes. It's like, here are all the things I want done. They're all being done and more than I could imagine, but I still wish we'd have had Hillary. And you're like,
and the reason I posted this is because we see these same kind of arguments on Facebook. I don't know if you do. And then, oh, I can't believe that evangelicals got behind Donald Trump. Oh, I can't believe that some of these people voted for him, you know. And don't you have buyer's remorse right now? I don't know. Let's see. Let's think of just last night when I was on a Hawaiian radio station, I went through just all the records he set, 12 justices to the Circuit Court of Appeals, breaking the record of certainly John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Now actually getting rid of so many regulations, it's now up to a ratio of 22 being removed for every one being implemented. These are records that have been broken by Donald Trump in his first year. And you will go through everything from what we talked about yesterday with Gary Bauer, the Mexico City policy, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, pulling out of Trans-Pacific Partnership, and on and on and on. The list is, goes on for pages on some of these things that we've posted. And then at the end say, nah, that's not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I'm not, I want to be charitable, but I mean, I think we see this in lots of different ways, but it's sort of the Trump distortion, or it's the I hate Trump and therefore I can't see.
Yes.
It's so common. It's what we see with media. It's what we see with, look, a lot of people really didn't like Barack Obama. But I think this is the first time we've seen where somebody so hated the president or whatever that they can't even see.
Well, they used to talk about Bush derangement.
Yeah.
Syndrome. I guess you have that again, so it may be, second time.
I just don't think it's the same, though. I have never seen anything to this level, and that's why you get to a point where a so-called conservative writer for the New York Times can write and say, let me list all these accomplishments that I'm just blown away by, and then say, but I wish we'd have had somebody else. I wish we'd have had the other party who wouldn't have done any of these things because they have a different approach and a different it just makes no sense. But I think this is, in some ways, the base that voted for him, this is the type of thing that's going to keep them fully in his camp, because it's just nuts to watch these kinds of things instead of sort of a logical of, well, he hasn't done this as well, and I think this could improve or whatever. Instead, it's, I just really don't like him, and so I don't care what he does. I don't care if he does the best things that any president has ever done. I want him impeached. I want him killed. It's just it's a craze.
Arrangement.
Yeah, it really is, and it doesn't, and it makes it hard to get, good political discussion, media that's fair, that actually presents things as to what's going on and in alternatives, and everything is sort of skewed right now to where nobody can trust anything because all these people are deranged. I mean, it really is an odd time. You can't trust anything you read, anything you hear. We'll get to the book, right? It's going to be the new thing. You wouldn't write some of the crazy things this guy wrote in the book unless it was kind of okay to write crazy things, because everybody's crazy about Trump, right? So you can say he didn't know who Boehner was. Meanwhile, he played golf with Boehner. He gave him $100,000 in donations at different events. I mean, you're like, hello, you're going to be caught in that lie. Well, if you're just so deranged that you just think, hey, let's hate him and let's throw everything, you don't act like a journalist, and you don't act like you're going to be caught. And so I really wish this thing would sort of clear out like a fog, like, something would blow through so that people could have an intelligent conversation and say, I don't like Trump because I disagree with his position on this, instead of this sort of deranged thing that really isn't connected to policy at this point.
Yeah, the criticisms that you read of Trump now are all personality-driven, and very little is policy-driven. It's come to that point, I think. Bret Stephens, I used to read him when he was at the Wall Street Journal, and he was really good on foreign policy, I thought, but I didn't think he was that conservative on other things.
No.
And, so they've moved him over. These liberal, progressive newspapers have an ordained conservative, but they're not that conservative. And I think some of these people, like Bret Stephens, don't really want to see the swamp drained. That's part of they're a moderate rhino Republican, and that's who they think should be running the country, not the right. And so, that's why you hear this from them. And they would have been more comfortable if Hillary had been in the White House. They truly would have.
Well, and again, one other thing to point out real quickly is one of the things we rarely talk about in terms of draining the swamp. They found that probably more people have left the State Department, and see, that gets back to Brett Stevens, and the Environmental Protection Agency than any other agencies.
On their own accord.
On their own accord. You know, they weren't sent packing, they just went packing. And so if you are convinced that what we've been doing out of Foggy Bottom, which is where the State Department is located, is good, then you see Trump as really bad, because then we're going to have a different kind of foreign policy. Second hour, we're going to talk about that foreign policy, whether that's a good idea or not. But we've got some phone calls, and so I'm going to give you a chance, whether you are, I don't think anybody here is a never Trumper, but some are asking about never Trumpers, so we'll take those phone calls, but we need to take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, and we'll also take your phone calls, so stay tuned. If you'd like to join us, I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Wall Street Journal columnist Daniel Henninger says there are two Trump presidencies that exist in parallel universes. One presidency is inhabited by Trump of Twitter. He continues, much of the American population is appalled by Trump of Twitter, who lives in a dark and deeply personal pool of feuds and fulminations. This made for a chaotic atmosphere in the early months and distracted from the real work that needed to be done. Mr. Henninger then describes the other presidency Trump inhabits, quote, a universe of solid, tangible economic success. It's characterized by Mr. Trump's stellar quality appointments to his cabinet and key White House policy roles. One of those appointments came 6 months in. Retired four-star Marine General John Kelly became White House Chief of Staff. Mr. Henninger writes, the relative calm Mr. Kelly's discipline brought to the White House has allowed the successes of the parallel Trump presidency to come into focus. Now we can look at the list of accomplishments in 2017 and see that it's long and solid. Yet the tweeting did not stop. Should it? Do conservatives want Trump to keep accomplishing good things but stop tweeting? We asked the question on live radio, and callers liked the accomplishments. Some admitted cringing at certain tweets, but none wanted them to stop. Are Daniel Henninger's two presidencies merging into one calmer administration? What happened to the appalled Americans? He says the president currently tweets with less unnerving animosity. Did General Kelly require this discipline? Or are presidential tweets wooing some critics by getting into their heads? Humorist Scott Adams, creator of the comic strip Dilbert, wrote in a column also for the Journal that many of the president's tweets are gems of persuasion. He says Mr. Trump has adroitly operated within a narrow range of useful wrongness on Twitter, employing devices like sticky nicknames, think Rocket Man. He uses weaponized humor to reveal truth. Perhaps it's working. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, weekend edition, Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. Let me just mention Penna Dexter's Viewpoints commentary, which we play at this particular point in the broadcast, and we'll play it again an hour from now on Trump tweets. I want to get to that in just a minute. But I also want to take some phone calls, so let's get a chance to hear from some of you. So in the state of Texas, KABX, Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
What would you like to add to our conversation?
Going back to Penna's remarks about the never Trumpers, how do the three of you feel about specifically Republican and or conservative never Trumpers? Do do you think that most never-Trumpers think that Ted Cruz or some of the other Republicans would have done as well and would have accomplished as much within their first year as Trump has?
It would be nice if they would write about that or talk about it, because in a sense, it almost took a personality like Donald Trump's to cut through some of this. I was a Ted Cruz fan, and I am a Ted Cruz fan, and I think he would make a great president. But it is possible that to break the stronghold of the swamp on Washington, D.C., we needed somebody way out of the box. I mean, we have to open ourselves up to that possibility. And, I think it would be a good discussion to have. Maybe the country's not quite ready to have it, maybe down the road. But you bring up a good point. I would love to hear some discussions about that.
My guess is, I'm guessing that people are being honest and, rational and et cetera. But my guess is that the never-Trumpers would have to admit that Donald Trump was probably the only one who would have won. And it's because if you look at the actual election results, he was the only one that was going to get, Wisconsin and these different places because of his trade talks, his really speaking to that group of people who'd been forgotten in the manufacturing industries in Ohio and in Wisconsin and Michigan and et cetera, and all these different places. Nobody else would. I mean, look, I was with Ted Cruz yesterday. He's a good friend of mine. We were there for a great moment, which is a friend of ours going on to the Federal Court of Appeals for life. I mean, a solid, conservative, brilliant attorney. But I don't think Ted could have won, the election. So I think most of them realize that. And I think I think they would be honest about that. I think the big thing with the never-Trumpers is I think there's two types of never-Trumpers. In that, Robert was calling about people who are conservative or Republican, not the never-Trumper. I don't consider a never-Trumper somebody who's progressive because they were never whoever on the Republican side.
Yeah.
But the never-Trumpers, I think there's two kinds. There's the kind that said, I was a never-Trumper, but I've got to admit he's doing good things. I don't like who he is, or I don't like his style or his personality or how he treats people or whatever. But they're honest about the good things that are being done, and they even might admit, I think I could have been wrong about what I said before the election. And then there's the ones that just have the blinders on. They hate him so much that they won't, either from pride or from blindness, they won't admit the truth. They won't bring these things out and weigh some of these things. And so you got two different kinds, the sort of the blinded ones and the ones who are humble enough to say, you know what, I'm shocked by a number of these good things that are being done under his administration, and I'm not sure we would have had this happen under anybody else. I mean, so I think you've got to look at them individual to individual. There's
one more never-Trumper, and I have friends who are in this category. Not very many anymore, but they're the ones who they're believers, they're Christians, they're very conservative, moral people, and they couldn't vote for a person who they didn't have respect for morally. And so, they liked President Bush because they thought he was a good man and he had a true repentance in his life. And so because of they think that it violates their faith to vote for Trump. The problem is they didn't have a choice of that type of a person. The only time they could have voted for someone who had that character that they wanted was someone who could have not gotten the nomination and definitely not won. So you have to be a realist in politics. Sure. You just do.
I wonder if, Mike Pence were to run in the future, because that's quite possibly would, whether some people say, well, I still can't vote for him, because there's a man who has character and is on all these issues equal. And that would, I think, ferret out some of the people that just use the never-Trumper excuse, but are really in step with some of the issues that we've talked about.
Yeah, and I look, we're going to talk. We'll talk about the book and some other things.
Yeah, we'll
get
to that.
The thing I would point out, especially to Christian audiences that are listening to this show, is, a lot of times this is exactly the type of person that God uses, somewhat to shame. The country. I think of
you see
Deborah,
that in history. Yeah, you see that in biblical history and in secular history. You sure do.
I see Deborah chosen by God to shame the men for not stepping up to their role, and you see all these things. I mean, we might pick, the Mike Pence type to come in and when the country is in great danger and all this, but God picks the Jehu types, I think Jehu's the wild man with the chariot or whatever, right? And a lot of crazy stuff happens. And so, whether you agree or not, whether you like or not, still know that God could be using this for his purposes. And certainly some of the good results, if they're good, you got to say, well, I can't explain it, but I'll just give God the glory for what's just happened. I mean, maybe we're about to save millions of lives through abortion. Maybe we could go through a long list of things. Look at the regulations, the economy, the blessing, the things that are happening with judges who are going to be on there for 30 years, decades. You just got to give God the glory and say, let's do the best we can, and let's forget the past, and let's move ahead and try to do the best we can for the future of our country.
I do want to get to Penna's commentary, but let me take another call real quickly because I want to give her a little more time to make a case. And so let's go to California real quickly. Pam, I think you had some comments real quickly. Well, I'll go to Pam in just a minute. Let's go to Brian in Georgia on the Good News Network. Brian, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Hey, I've been listening here, and, I think y'all have hit it really on the head about the kind of person that God puts in, any office at the time. And if we think back to Romney, McCain, and even George Bush, how those guys kind of, I guess you could say when the attacks were coming at them, they tended to sit back and not really do anything. They weren't on the offensive. They were on the defense a lot.
I love what Gary Bauer said yesterday. Donald Trump knows how to take a punch, and he knows how to throw a punch.
He promised he would do that. He said he wouldn't sit back.
Yeah, and in his debates, all of his debates, he never, ever let Hillary, sneak one in. He immediately jumped on it and said, no, that's a lie. That's not true, And thinking back on all the other debates with all the other candidates, they kind of – Romney had one really great debate, that very first one. He was aggressive, that's what we were looking for. And then the other ones, it seemed like he was on his heels the whole time. But with Trump, he was always leaning forward. It was always going after offense. And even Pence has that quiet demeanor, but I think he took that cue from Trump. And even in his debate, he was on the offense quite a bit, just saying, hey, look, you guys did this is a lie, that's not true, that kind of stuff.
Good point.
And, and another point with all the news, I don't even watch the news anymore because it's just so, it's just, like y'all said, it's just so nuts. I have never, ever seen news media this blatantly just lie, and it's just so blatant. I can't stand it. When my wife turns it on, I just walk out of the room. I'm like, hey, I'll go.
I understand that. We're going to take a break, but I think we get the point, and I hope you listen to Point of View because we, if nothing else, post a lot of articles so you can read them for yourself. And we've only worked our way through a few of the articles. 1 hour, got another hour to go. So we'll come back and take some more phone calls and get into the book and foreign policy and so many other issues we'll try to cover in the next hour right after these important messages.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We have a number of callers on the line. We'll get to them in just a minute. First hour, spent some time talking about religious liberty. We also talked about whether character counts, but also do results count? And that is one of the articles we've posted for you. We're going to get into some of the things about the book, Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, and we have some Anchor phone calls. But one of the other things we always like to encourage you to do is go to the website, and you will see the Viewpoints commentary. And Penna Dexter's commentary today is called Trump Tweets. And if you sign up for the commentaries, you get mine Monday through Friday in your inbox, and you get hers on Saturday. Now, let's talk about that, because when people sometimes talk about Donald Trump, and they complain, and I've noticed this on the phone, but I've noticed it on all sorts of other talk shows. They say, well, what about the tweets? What about the tweets? You've written about this.
Yeah, a lot of people that I know say, I just wish he wouldn't tweet so much. But tweeting is part of his personality and his modus operandi, and he does it. And I think at this point we ought to just agree that it's just part of Trump. It's probably part of the presidency now, because presidents see that they have a way of communicating directly with the American people. They don't have this filter of the media and this distortion. So, you know, last week on the show, I talked about a couple of columns in the Wall Street Journal. One of them I mentioned in this commentary, where Daniel Henninger says there are two Trump presidencies that exist in parallel universes, and one is inhabited by Trump of Twitter. That's what he calls it, Trump of Twitter. And he says much of America is appalled by that, and that and I'm quoting him, this Trump of Twitter lives in a dark and deeply personal pool of feuds and fulminations. Mm-hmm. And this made for, of course, a very chaotic atmosphere, which is described in the Wolf book that we're going to talk about as the program progresses. So we did have a chaotic atmosphere. We did have missteps, misappointments, badly managed people, chiefs of staff that were competing for one another. We had all of that. But then Daniel Henninger describes the other presidency that Trump inhabits, and he says it's one of accomplishments, a universe of solid, tangible economic success, stellar quality appointments to the cabinet, key White House policy roles. And a lot of this, he sees a turning point, is when General Kelly was appointed chief of staff. And then he did bring some calm and some discipline. And so we have had all these accomplishments that we've talked about on Point of View, but the tweeting continues. And so the question is, do conservatives want to the tweeting to stop? And we asked that question on the program last week. We didn't have really enough people to say we had a poll, but we didn't have anybody that said they wanted the tweeting to stop from our listenership that called in. And so, they like the accomplishments. And, yes, you cringe sometimes when Trump tweets certain things. But then, I don't know, I have to get my humble side on and sit back and look at what the tweets are for. And there's sort of a marketing component to them, I think. And so that's where you can go to the analysis of how this man operates, how he has always operated as a real estate tycoon in New York. And so there was another piece by Scott Adams in the Wall Street Journal. This was a few months back. Scott Adams created the comic strip Dilbert. And he said that many of the president's tweets are actually gems of persuasion. And when you look at some of them, they on their face they are. Others, aren't.
Yeah. Others are shot across the bow or whatever.
They are.
Yeah.
But he talks about a narrow range of useful wrongness that he practices on Twitter. So in a sense, the ways we feel about Trump, maybe he is actually inviting some of that criticism he's inviting in order to then accomplish a purpose or allow something to happen. So, I'm not sure he's as dumb as this book makes him out to be. I think he's actually a lot smarter than we give him credit for.
Let me again encourage you to, even today, maybe download this article, Trump Tweets, put it on your Facebook page. It'll start a conversation. And again, if you would like to subscribe, we've made it very easy for you to do that as well. Let's go back to the phones. In California, Pam, thank you for joining us today. What would you like to add to the conversation? We'd love to hear your point of view.
Good morning to you, my brothers and sisters in Christ. Happy New Year also. I'm going to make 3 comments so I could get out of the way. I love this program. I love hearing people what they have to say, that call in, etc. Okay, number one, I love our President Trump. Why? Because he has done what he said he was going to do. We are not waiting 4 or 6 years to see what he said he is going to do. This country is in shock because we are so used to all these promises all the time, and we don't see them come through. The second thing, you don't have to like Donald Trump. That's your prerogative. But as President of the United States, the office of President, respect that office. I have seen where the media won't even refer to him as President Donald Trump. And what I see going on in this country, we are losing respect for authority, from the president to law enforcement. Last but not least, I had a sister in Christ, Brazilian. She went for her U.S. citizenship. We went to the Staples Center. 100 flags, 102 citizens raising their hand, taking an oath to become citizens of the United States legally. It was one of the most beautiful sights I had ever seen, besides someone getting baptized, giving their life to Christ, or getting infilled with the baptism of the Holy Ghost. More people should go and see one of those ceremonies. If those people take the time and test and do what it has to do to become an American citizen, then do it. We are a country of law. Obey the law of the land. And I'm done.
Well, it's all good, and it was worth waiting for. So, Pam, thank you for sharing that today. Let's, if we can, take one more phone call, and then we're going to get into that book about Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, and we'll go to Texas, KBJS. Ozella, thank you for calling today here on Point of View.
Yes, how are you doing today?
Very good. I think you had a question for us, so go for it.
Yes, I want to know what the swamp is, the meaning for it.
You know, that is a phrase that Ronald Reagan used. It's a phrase that Pat Buchanan used, but it's one that Donald Trump used a lot. And they've all talked about draining the swamp. And I think it's a way of saying that we have certain entrenched bureaucrats. And there have been people over time that have suggested that sometimes it almost doesn't matter whether you elect a Republican president or a Democratic president. Let me use one example. The State Department just kind of has its own foreign policy, and it kind of just does its own thing. And so that's what I think he really meant by the swamp. Kelly?
Yeah, I think if you've ever been to D.C., you realize it's kind of a city surrounded by almost like a little swampy, surrounding.
It was an old swamp at one time,
And so it comes a little bit from there, but it's the people that sort of entrench themselves and never go away. They kind of hunker in.
The K Street lobbyists.
That's right. And the leaders come in and come out, and yet the government seems to not change because nobody has bothered to clean out the swamp. And so now some of it is cleaning out itself because people are leaving.
Right. I just mentioned that.
There are a lot of people who what they do is they come in under one administration, let's say in the Justice Department or you name the industry, and then they hunker in and wait for the next president till their party gets back, and meanwhile they're causing trouble the whole time and leaking things, and that's kind of what we're talking about.
I think so. It's a good question because we do hear the phrase. We'll talk a little bit more about that and get into the book right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, someone who tuned into Point of View for the first time left a comment on the Facebook page criticizing what one of my guests said and concluded by instructing us that Christians should embrace socialism. It's the type of comment I usually ignore, but I thought it might deserve a response since I've heard it so often. Over the last few months, I've been teaching through the book of Acts. When you get to Acts 4, you find a statement that the believers had all things in common. It also says those who possessed land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds to the apostles' feet. They distributed these gifts to anyone in need. It is worth noting that, number one, this practice was apparently only done in Jerusalem, and number two, the practice was a voluntary act. This is hardly a mandate for socialism. Many Christian writers have devoted whole chapters in their books on this subject, so there is more than I can possibly say here. The believers in Jerusalem owned the property before they voluntarily gave the proceeds to the apostles. The next chapter clearly teaches that. When Peter confronted Ananias, he clearly stated, "While it remained, was it not your own? After it was sold, was it not in your own control?" Owning property contradicts one of the fundamental principles of socialism. In the Communist Manifesto, the abolition of property is a major item in the plan for moving from capitalism to socialism and eventually to communism. The 10 Commandments assume private property. The 8th Commandment forbidding stealing and the 10th Commandment about coveting both assume that people have private property rights. In the New Testament, Paul writes, "Let him who stole steal no more." Socialism is incompatible with Christianity. That's why Christians should not embrace socialism. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, that does open up some lines, 1-800-351-1212. Or again, feel free to just sit back as we have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. And we've been talking about the book, and what we mean is the book called Fire and Fury, written by Michael Wolff. Now, one of the things that we posted is a very good kind of summary about kind of the rift between Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And, of course, there are all sorts of things being leaked, Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, about what is in the book. This is a way to build an audience and to get people, as I understand, standing in line at bookstores for a book that's not even out yet. So we understand that.
Seems to be working.
Yeah, it seems to be working. But at the same time, I'll just make my one comment. Don't anybody at these publishing houses do any fact-checking? Because as these stories have come out, there are all sorts of people saying, this is not true. I did not say this. Or when you say, as Kelly mentioned a few minutes ago, that Donald Trump did not even know former Speaker of the House John Boehner. What? They played golf together many times. He donated almost $100,000 to him. What? I mean, there are just some parts of this book that have to just be completely erroneous, which is why, again, I tell our listeners, read things on the internet, but even read books with some kind of skepticism and check them out.
Well, with this book, I mean, really the basis of this book is over 200 interviews that the author apparently did with people inside the White House, and he recorded them. Mm-hmm. So he built a case of a Trump that he wanted to describe, and he changed. It seems to me that he changed facts in order to support the case, in a sense. And here's another one that we, during the break, you found, Kerby. Katie Walsh, she was the deputy chief of staff, And she was an experienced political person. She left fairly early because she was frustrated. It was hard for her to work according to the way she normally worked.
Yeah.
So she left.
And I can understand that with Donald Trump. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, the book quotes her as saying that that he was so childlike. It was trying to figure out what a child wants. This is how Trump acted. And she says now she never said this.
Yeah.
So, who do you believe? Do you believe Michael Wolff, who is actually, there are many people talking about how he tends to stretch the truth or make up his own facts, or do you believe her?
Yeah. Well, again, Kelly, we're hearing that he was childish, but some of the reactions to Donald Trump seem childish. But again, maybe I'm missing something here.
Well, I mean, I'm looking right now at a news report that has quotes Michael Wolff as saying, not sure his allegations are true. That's not exactly a very comforting thing. And it says that at the very start of the book, there's a note included that's, as they say, casts significant doubt in the reliability of the specifics contained in the rest of its pages. I mean, it kind of reminds me of David Barton's old story about the book that started to change our history. And that there was a note at the beginning that says, the scholars in this book have decided to dispense with the scholarly use of footnotes. And so there's no footnotes for anything they say. And it's kind of like this. It's like the beginning of the book. He kind of says, well, I can't vouch for all the factual veracity of what I'm saying, so just decide for yourself.
Yeah.
That's how his own book starts out.
The trouble is, I know that there are people waiting in line for the book, but most people don't read it. They just read what's said about it. Mm-hmm. And so what is done then is the people who want to criticize Trump pick up on a lot of the things that are in the book because you're quoting people that work in the White House, supposedly, and they use it. And so this book influences public opinion because, or at least it's a risk of doing so, even though a lot of it isn't true, because it's out there and people just believe in and buy into it, and they don't, dig into it like we're trying to do here on Point of View. So it's in a sense, it's a tool, and the left wants to portray Trump as someone worthy of being impeached or having the 25th Amendment used to take him out of office. I mean, there's an agenda for that. I mean, I've seen ads on television from
that's right,
Tom Steyer, who's funding this whole effort to impeach Trump. So, it plays into all of this. And, the question is, what is the American public going to do with something like this? Some people are eating it up.
Well, we had Gary Bauer on yesterday, and his end-of-day report yesterday said, President Trump is portrayed in the book as having no interest in briefings and being unaware of key facts. He said that's simply untrue. In my conversations with the president, he's always shown a wide grasp of knowledge and details which help explain the incredible success he has had in his life. As Gary Bauer says, you don't become a billionaire by being dumb. More importantly, he doesn't have to actually read, and basically what he's going on to say is he doesn't have to agree with every liberal idea out there, and he doesn't have to necessarily listen to every stupid idea out there either. So part of the point is there are individuals that wanted to get the president's ear. They didn't get the president's ear, so he said, well, he just isn't really interested in facts or information or policy. No, he just doesn't suffer fools gladly, does he?
No, and I think Gary points out a number of different people who have come forward and said,
yes,
he quoted me inaccurately. I didn't say
quite
that.
Quite a list in here now, and it's growing by the day, apparently.
You sort of add that to all the quotes from major newspapers. I think there's New York Times quote, there's Washington Post quote, there's a number of them where they refer to this author as somebody who you really can't rely upon what he says. So you add the reputation he has to the fact that people are saying, I didn't say that. And the fact that he said, well, Trump didn't even know who Boehner was. He's so dumb. No, you're so dumb. You didn't bother to check and find out that he's played golf with Trump numerous times, that he's been contributed money to. Of course, Trump knew. While he was running for office, Boehner was the speaker. Of course he knew who Boehner was. So I think now you really can't trust anything in his book. But we're going to hear about it still, and it's going to be all kinds of fodder for media. But it's sad that you'd have somebody that would do this, and the publisher included, when so many things are clearly not accurate and hadn't been battened down.
You know, part of the book is about, sort of elevates Steve Bannon and the treatment of him and what his agenda was. And, you know, that it kind of overplays, I think, the role he had in electing Trump, although he did have a big role in getting Trump elected. I think at a certain point in the campaign when he was brought in, and also Kellyanne Conway, things turned around. So it does that. And I think Steve Bannon was a positive to some degree, but some of his actions and statements since he left, he's tried to bring in candidates who would, he says, to support Trump's agenda, but sometimes he has not been as savvy about what he's done because there's some political factors that should play in too. So it says something, I think, that his main funders, the Mercer family Foundation, who put a lot of money into the Trump campaign, who support the Breitbart paper, they're very powerful there, they're billionaires. They have already, even before this book came out, they have begun to drain their support and pulled away from Steve Bannon. And so it, in a sense, that I think lends or de-lends credibility to this book because what they've done, they've really pulled away from the ban, and yet they still support Trump.
You know, Senator John Cornyn from Texas is also the Senate Majority Whip, and he said that the falling out with Mr. Bannon would be good for the party's chances in 2018. Said Mr. Bannon was out recruiting candidates who were unelectable in the general election. We need to get back to working and nominating good electable candidates. There's some truth to that, isn't there?
Some truth to that. You know, I think, you know, in a sense, we need conservatives, but sometimes when you have someone who's conservative and you're going to try to out-conservative that person rather than get some people in that are going to support that person, you have to be a little more thoughtful about that. And I'm afraid Steve Bannon was perhaps not as wise as he should have been in some of the support that he was.
I want to get
lending.
Kelly's comments, too, about we're coming up to a break, so we might have to get him afterwards. But, you know, we've got 24 Democratic seats up, plus 2 more that are independent. So you have 26. And I said on a talk show last night, and I think we would agree with this around the table, that in some respects, Democrats are going to be playing defense anyway. And Gary Bauer the other day said he could identify maybe 5 Democratic Senate seats that are in places that Donald Trump did well where they might lose. But he also identified maybe 3 he thought of Republican seats that could go. So it could be a net of +2, but it could be a net of +5. That would change everything, of course, as well. So back to this issue, getting the right candidate in the right Senate race could make all the difference in the world. So I want to get Kelly's comments, but I know we're coming up to a break, and when we come back, we'll also take a phone call. Some of you not all together sold on Donald Trump, so I'd love to hear your comments as well, and then we'll also get into some of the foreign policy issues. Very difficult time to be the president or the Secretary of State or even a UN ambassador, much less your Secretary of Defense, when we talk about North Korea and Iran. So we've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. Let's go to some phone calls, and then we have some other issues on the table to discuss. In Texas, KCTA. TC, thank you for calling today.
Hi, Kerby.
Hey, what's your point of view?
My point of view is I see all these phony church leaders fawning over Trump. Rick Warren, Robinson, Paul and White, Copeland, Beth Moore, Baker, Osteen, Ronnie Floyd, Southern Baptist, George Wood, Assembly of God, the Mormon bishops, etc. Then his wife was bowing down to the Pope, repeating the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, like she needs a piece of bread. She's married to a billionaire. I mean, these people are ridiculous, man. I mean, I hope Trump becomes a Christian. You know, I heard him say on a religious program that they asked him directly, did you ever trust Jesus as your Savior? And he says, well, I believe in cleaning up my own messes myself.
Yep. And again, there's some people that have said maybe he's become a Christian in the midst of that. I don't know. I mean, what about this? You know, there are some people that are saying, well, how close should the evangelical leaders be to Donald Trump and things like that? And I think PC raises a good question. So what about that?
I think he does, too. I don't resonate when people that are close to Trump that are evangelical leaders say he's a Christian. I mean, unless they know something that hasn't been apparent in Trump's public statements,
right,
it's hard to see.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the question is does he have to, I mean, for some people, if they're not a Christian, I guess they're not legitimate. But the thing is we didn't have the choice between two Christians in the election. We don't always get a Christian in the White House. It's always nice to have that. But do you want a Christian, or do you want someone that's going to accomplish the things that actually align with the Bible in many cases?
Would you rather have the once married evangelical Christian, born again Christian, good guy Jimmy Carter, or the twice divorced California movie star guy Ronald Reagan? I mean, when you start looking at some of this, you realize, it's beyond those kind of labels. And again, as we talked about earlier, God uses very different people, and he might not use who we want to use. But the question is, what is the person going to do? Because that's what really matters. It's kind of like if you're going in for heart surgery and you have a guy who's got not good morals, but you happen to know the results of his surgery is going to be really good, but you happen to know that the great Christian guy is going to mess up and you're going to die. I think you pick the guy that's immoral. And I'm not saying, that morality is irrelevant and all that, but I'm saying the most important thing is what they're going to do, because what they're going to do does have a lot of moral implications. It has to do with innocent life. It has to do with a lot of the institutions that God has put in place. And so that's the important thing, is what are they going to do? And I think the judges alone, if you look at what's happened, I mean, I think we're one justice away from Roe v. Wade being over, from the same-sex marriage decision of the Supreme Court being over. I think a lot of these things that have been forced on the country that they did not choose, that were not moral, being gone. And that's just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. So I think you got to look at what they do. What are their policies? What do they put in place? What are the people? Probably the most important thing is what people do they put in place, because if you're the president, you do very little. You delegate all this to people, and especially I don't think anybody's delegated more than this guy, because I think he's not a politician. So he's kind of said, hey, I know this is really important. Who are the best conservative minds on the economy? Oh, I'll get Steve Moore and these people. Oh, who are the best on, getting rid of regulations? Oh, I'll get these guys on. Oh, who are the best on judges? And that's why we're seeing sort of record accomplishments, because whatever you think of Trump, he is putting the right people in place, and incredibly, solid and conservative things are being done. And that's, I think, the most important thing, is looking at what the person is actually doing.
I will say, because our caller talked about the church leaders, and I think their role, some people, when they get into that position, it gets to their head, and so they become an arm of the party. I think that we in the religious right have been critiqued for that, and I think rightly so to some degree. But when they're there, I'm glad he has these faith leaders around him, and I think their role is always to seek God, and then to be a voice of faith to that person. They're to be an advisor. And of all the presidents, I think Reagan did this too, but Trump does want advice because he doesn't know. And so he asks questions. And so they have a great opportunity to sometimes speak truth to power that's hard to speak. And if they do that, then they're placed there for that purpose, I think. So, if they're fawning and if they're compromising their values, then that's not good. But if they're actually there as a source of wisdom, then great. They should be there.
Can they have a prayer in the cabinet room? That was controversial the other day. And I just can't even imagine that would have a few decades ago been controversial. But it was controversial to have Dr. Ben Carson pray in a cabinet
Our press
meeting.
has no category for that.
They simply do not.
That's right. Trump asked him to pray. And I think the day when all the leaders, he has his, what's it called, Religious Advisory Council, and a number of those pastors, religious leaders, I think Trump, it wasn't like an hour meeting with the president. They were there all day. And the reports were, and I knew people who were in that meeting, because there's only like 20 of these people. They said he did not want them to leave. They were praying over him. They were doing everything. And so I think, however bombastic you see him, how about just maybe he's a guy that knows that he needs prayer, that he knows he needs God. I think he does. And if there's a humility that you don't see very often, that is there. And so you just don't know. We don't know. I mean, the heart is pretty deceptive to all of us, and I don't think anybody can see anybody's heart very clearly. Only God knows, and so we just need to pray for God to really minister to him, and we're called to pray for the president, whoever that is, and we should have been doing that all the last years, whoever was president, and definitely I think if people really are concerned, they need to pray even more now, and lift him up and hope that good things happen. The thing that I don't like is I think a lot of people, because they've sort of invested in him being bad or not liking him, want to see bad things happen. I think it's that way with the tax reform. You see people almost wishing for bad for the country so that they can then be justified in not liking the president. And, boy, you've got a really twisted heart if that's where you are, and it should be a revelation to you that, you know what, God needs to work on me because my values, my beliefs are out of whack here because this is not what God calls me to do.
Yes. Well, one of the things you said just in passing, I thought we might talk about for just a second, and that is because he's not a professional politician. And I was on a talk show the other day, people saying, well, isn't that a problem? I said, well, it turned out it's kind of an asset because when George W. Bush or Herbert Walker Bush is in office, they're going to get their buddies in to various cabinet positions, various judicial appointments. I don't think Harriet Miers would have been very good on the Supreme Court, if I can pick one. That's maybe a cheap shot, but it's true. And this man who has not been around politics, you have to go all the way back, as I said, to maybe Herbert Hoover before you had a businessman who became a politician, because we've had Governor all sorts of individuals, Governor Bill Clinton and Governor George W. Bush and Governor Jimmy Carter, as well as Senator John Kennedy and Senator Barack Obama, and on and on. Those are individuals that are going to pull from their contacts. When Donald Trump gets into office, he says, I don't know who to pick for the judiciary. I know I will ask the Heritage Foundation. I'll ask the Federalist Society. I'll ask First Liberty. I'll ask somebody about that. I don't know who to put in the State Department, so I'll go to some people that maybe are outside of the normal sphere, outside of the swamp, to come up with ideas. And that's why in this first year, he's been, I think, a lot more successful, don't you think?
I do. I mean, I think his results are unequaled. And again, I think it's because of what you're saying. It's because we're in a country, this is a big country. I mean, the president can't make all the decisions for all these different things. Now, I know Trump would like to say he is making all those decisions, but he is delegating really well. I mean, he's picking people who really do have expertise. The politics are out of it. One of the concerns I had is he would bring his New York buddies or something like that, right?
That's what I wondered about.
And it hasn't really happened.
No.
I mean, not in the cabinets and all this thing. Obviously, he's got
Kushner
in the White House and
sure.
Ivanka and all that. But that's just family, and it's not like they're heading the Department of, whatever. So I think he's, again, I don't agree with all of his appointments. I would change a couple of things. But overall, his results are really hard to compete with.
When you talk about bringing your friends, whoever you are in politics, and you have a long history in politics, I see that as a little bit of the swamp, too. Because you're bringing people that have worked their way up through politics. This kind of jumps over all of that, kind of, I don't know, gets you out of that swampiness.
I would agree. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Wall Street Journal columnist Daniel Henninger says there are two Trump presidencies that exist in parallel universes. One presidency is inhabited by Trump of Twitter. He continues, much of the American population is appalled by Trump of Twitter, who lives in a dark and deeply personal pool of feuds and fulminations. This made for a chaotic atmosphere in the early months and distracted from the real work that needed to be done. Mr. Henninger then describes the other presidency Trump inhabits, quote, a universe of solid, tangible economic success. It's characterized by Mr. Trump's stellar quality appointments to his cabinet and key White House policy roles. One of those appointments came 6 months in. Retired four-star Marine General John Kelly became White House Chief of Staff. Mr. Henninger writes, The relative calm Mr. Kelly's discipline brought to the White House has allowed the successes of the parallel Trump presidency to come into focus. Now we can look at the list of accomplishments in 2017 and see that it's long and solid. Yet the tweeting did not stop. Should it? Do conservatives want Trump to keep accomplishing good things but stop tweeting? We asked the question on live radio, and callers liked the accomplishments. Some admitted cringing at certain tweets, but none wanted them to stop. Are Daniel Henninger's two presidencies merging into one calmer administration? What happened to the appalled Americans? He says the president currently tweets with less unnerving animosity. Did General Kelly require this discipline? Or are presidential tweets wooing some critics by getting into their heads? Humorist Scott Adams, creator of the comic strip Dilbert, wrote in a column also for the Journal that many of the president's tweets are gems of persuasion. He says Mr. Trump has adroitly operated within a narrow range of useful wrongness on Twitter, employing devices like sticky nicknames, think Rocket Man. He uses weaponized humor to reveal truth. Perhaps it's working. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I didn't want to give short shrift to foreign policy, but I think it is appropriate to talk about it before the program ends. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. And when we look at Iran, first of all, I see a real difference, and I'll go around the round table and see if you do. In 2009, the reaction from, at that time, President Barack Obama was muted. Now we know a little bit more because he was behind the scenes trying to come up with a nuclear deal. And the lack of reaction from Barack Obama and even the United Nations when there was tumult in the streets is very different than the reaction of the last week or so from Donald Trump. And so I see a real striking difference in terms of how Donald Trump, who many people thought was going to be like a Ron Paul isolationist and not say anything about what has happened in world affairs, at least with his tweets, is saying, you know, I stand with the people there and it's time to get a regime change.
Yeah, well, in this case, Donald Trump, I think one of his principal points on foreign policy has been that the Iran nuclear deal was a horrible deal. And so, you know, part of this deal was that it was going to help the Iranian people because we were going to be lifting sanctions internationally. And also there was about $100 billion of unfrozen assets that were going to be injected into the Iranian economy. But what really happened, and one of the things that people are upset about, is that it's been spent on the nuclear program, number one, and there's a lot of corruption, and it's also been spent on spreading terrorism abroad. So the people aren't benefiting. Then there's a whole new economic plan that's hurting them. They've got inflation and higher taxes. So they're hurting. And it's a lot of young people. That I think the unemployment rate among young people is like 40% in Iran. So their lives didn't benefit from that nuclear deal at all. And so they're protesting that. And this plays right in to Donald Trump's desire to blow that thing up anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't think of anything worse. The worst foreign policy decision that I can think of in the history of the country was the Iran deal. It was just I think most of the country was like, we're giving hundreds of billions of dollars to who?
Mm-hmm.
To a terrorist regime that, would love to, blow us off the map, and we're going to give them billions and billions and billions of dollars to do that with. And we're doing it because we can trust them, because they're going to stop their nuclear. I mean, I think everybody thought this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so now we're finding out that because of that, we didn't, we stopped on some, DEA and other things where, guns were being run to the United States by Hezbollah and where drugs were being brought into the country by these people. But we didn't prosecute them because we wanted the Iran deal to go through. The foreign policy, whatever people think of Barack Obama, his foreign policy was just horrific. I mean, we ended up in trouble everywhere. I mean, nobody respected us, and horrible mistakes. So it doesn't surprise me at all that when we have a new president, and I don't whether it was Donald Trump or anybody else, I think historically we would have said, hey, we're for the freedom people. We're for the people who are protesting in Iran. We actually want them to have freedom. And so, God bless President Trump. I mean, that we have a president that actually now is in favor of not oppression and tyranny in Iran and propping them up with hundreds of billions of dollars, but is actually in favor of something moving towards democracy where people are saying, we just can't stand under this oppression. So that's what we're supposed to do, is speak out and support. And in the past, we've even provided, background support to those people. And, of course, in the past, they've been murdered by the regime. But this seems to be so systemic that they can't murder all the people who are upset because it's so much of their country right now.
Seems like a spiritual revival taking place, too. Operation World estimates that there are probably more Muslims in Iran that have become Christians in the last 20 years than in the previous 13 centuries. Now, Operation World assumes that there's at least 1 million Christians in Iran. There's another group that I quoted earlier in the week that says there might be 3 million. So in some respects, they're saying the fastest growing church in the world right now is in Iran. So that's another one of those background stories you won't hear from the secular media. But while Iran is kind of in tumult, you also have North Korea. And I have to believe that Iran is looking at how we handle North Korea, because North Korea has nuclear weapons and Iran would like to have them. And so how we handle North Korea, especially with the Winter Games about ready to come to South Korea, I think is going to be another test of the leadership of Donald Trump, don't you think?
Yeah, and of course, some of it is the international community and how they deal with North Korea. North Korea and the Olympics it's a thorny problem. I don't really even know what I think about that, except that whatever we do, we have to keep into consideration the security and safety of South Korea, which is so close to North Korea that there's threats there. So I don't know. I think that the pronouncements of the president need to be simple and strong. And he needs to maintain the idea that America will always protect its interests and that we stand firmly against them attaining the nuclear capability to launch a missile that would reach the United States. And he has been stronger than any other president on that. And he's rallied the international community to some degree. It just needs to continue. It needs to march forward.
Well, and he's been in China, too, and maybe you could say to China, they could also launch a missile towards you, maybe not even to hit the mainland, but just to explode it over the atmosphere and have an electromagnetic pulse knock out all the electronics in China, just like it could knock out all the electronics in North America. So maybe we can convince them in China that it's in their best interest, too, to bring the kind of pressure that they're not bringing up until now.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think President Trump inherited a problem that was kicked down the road.
Yeah, it didn't just happen a year ago, right?
And nobody has figured out the answer to this. I mean, to be honest, this problem was caused ultimately really by Bill Clinton. We would never be in this situation if we hadn't allowed the nuclear expansion to begin with our foolishness in that deal. But that now gets them to where they're playing with nuclear weapons and shooting things towards our allies and on all this. And at least Trump's trying to do something. I don't think anybody has the exact, perfect answer for how to treat them. And maybe they don't like the "my button is bigger than your button" tweet. But I don't know. I mean, I just, when I see tweets like that, I think of the Jeb Bush as being his biggest opponent in the Republican primary, and then him sort of branding him as low energy.
It worked.
And it destroyed him. politically in the campaign. And so, he's got some marketing sort of instincts so I don't know. Maybe that works. I mean, soon after that, I see that North Korea is going to meet with South Korea.
So,
and does anybody think that would have happened if Trump was not sort of pushing? So I don't know. I just know that I don't think any of us have the exact answer, because you're dealing with a kind of a crazy dictator. And how do you handle that? I think you need a lot of prayer and God's guidance. But, I think people that criticize are being, fairly I think they're being unfair, because it's like, okay, what did you say with how Obama handled the situation, or Bush or Clinton? It hadn't been handled well. It's been kicked down the road, and at least our president is trying to do something about it in a time where really something does need to be done.
Well, again, let me just mention some of the articles. First one actually takes you to firstliberty.org, an organization worthy of your support. Of course, we have the one by Rebecca Hagelin, we have one by Cal Thomas, and we have one about Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. So all of it at the website, pointofview.net, and Penna Dexter's commentary today, if you would like to get that. So all of those are resources available at the website, pointofview.net. Hope you have a great weekend. We're going to be watching the national championship in football Monday night, so we'll talk about that on Monday. But if nothing else, I hope that you'll visit the website, pointofview.net, and if you can leave a donation, we would greatly appreciate that. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800